I'm standing at the back of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, rain dripping from my matted hair onto the worn wooden floor, staring at my own funeral. The mahogany casket sits surrounded by white lilies and red roses, the exact arrangement I'd always told my mother I wanted when I was old enough to have such morbid conversations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 200 people fill the pews, dabbing their eyes with tissues, sharing stories about my life, my dreams, my tragic disappearance 3 months ago. What they don't know is that I'm very much alive, and I've been hiding in plain sight for reasons that would shatter everything they think they know about our perfect family. My name is Rebecca Chen, though most people called me Becca before I vanished without a trace on a cold February morning. I'm 28 years old, a former elementary school teacher who loved morning coffee with extra cream and spent weekends volunteering at the animal shelter. At least, that's who I was before I discovered the truth that forced me to disappear from my own life. 3 months ago, I lived in a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, just 15 minutes from my childhood home where my parents still resided. I thought I had the perfect family. My father, David Chen, worked as a respected accountant for several local businesses, known throughout our community for his integrity and kindness. My mother, Linda, taught piano lessons from our family home and volunteered at the church every Sunday. My younger brother, Michael, 25, had just graduated from law school and was preparing for the bar exam. We were the kind of family that neighbors pointed to as an example of the American dream successfully achieved by hardworking immigrants. My parents had emigrated from Taiwan in the early 80s, arriving with nothing but determination and an unwavering belief in education. They spoke often of their struggles during those first years, how they worked multiple jobs while learning English, how they saved every penny to buy their first small house in a safe neighborhood with good schools. Their sacrifices, they reminded us constantly, were all for Michael and me. We were their legacy, their proof that coming to America had been worth every hardship. Growing up, I never questioned the stories they told us about our family history. My father would speak proudly of his father, my grandfather, who had been a successful businessman in Taiwan before the political upheaval forced their family to start over. My mother shared memories of her own parents, whom she described as educators who valued knowledge above material possessions. They painted a picture of a respectable family background, one that we should honor through our own achievements and moral conduct. I excelled in school, partly from natural aptitude but mostly from the gentle, yet persistent pressure to succeed that permeated our household. My parents never screamed or demanded perfect grades, but their disappointment when I brought home anything less than an A was palpable. They would sit me down for long conversations about wasted potential and missed opportunities, about how education was the only inheritance they could leave us. Michael and I learned early that love in our family was conditional on performance, though it took me years to recognize this dynamic for what it was. After high school, I attended Portland State University, majoring in elementary education because I genuinely loved working with children. My parents had hoped I would choose something more prestigious, like medicine or law, but they eventually accepted my decision when they saw how passionate I was about teaching. I graduated summa cum laude, landed a position at Riverside Elementary School, and moved into my own apartment while maintaining close ties with my family. For 7 years, I lived what I thought was a fulfilling life. I loved my third-grade students, spending my own money on classroom supplies, and staying late to help struggling readers. I dated occasionally but never seriously, partly because my work was demanding and partly because I was still very close to my parents and spent most of my free time with them. Every Sunday, I joined them for church and family dinner. Every holiday, we gathered at their house for elaborate celebrations where my mother cooked traditional Taiwanese dishes alongside American favorites. My brother Michael had always been the golden child, though my parents tried to hide their favoritism. He was taller than our father, naturally charismatic, and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made law school seem effortless. While I was praised for my kindness and dedication, Michael was celebrated for his potential to achieve greatness. My parents spoke of his future with a reverence they never quite applied to my career as a teacher. I understood, or thought I did. Teaching was important. But it wasn't the kind of success that validated their immigration story the way a lawyer's son would. The dynamic in our family shifted subtly when Michael graduated law school. My parents threw him an elaborate party, inviting distant relatives and family friends to celebrate his achievement. During his speech that night, my father became emotional, talking about how proud he was, how Michael represented everything they had dreamed of when they left Taiwan. I was happy for my brother, genuinely so, but I also felt a familiar pang of inadequacy. No matter what I accomplished, it seemed small in comparison to Michael's trajectory toward professional prominence. It was during this period that I started noticing small inconsistencies in my parents' stories about our family history. Nothing dramatic, just minor details that didn't quite align with previous versions of the same events. When I mentioned my grandfather's business to a family friend who had known our relatives in Taiwan, she looked confused and said she remembered him working in a factory. When I asked my mother about a photograph I'd found of her parents, she quickly changed the subject and put the picture away. These moments were fleeting, and I dismissed them as the natural evolution of family stories over time. My relationship with my parents remained close, but I began to sense an underlying tension that I couldn't quite identify. They asked more questions about my daily routines, seemed more interested in my social life and work schedule than they had been before. At first, I attributed this to empty nest syndrome, now that both their children were adults living independently. My mother started calling me multiple times a day, always with some small excuse, like asking about my weekend plans or reminding me about upcoming family events. The first real crack in my perception of our family came last November, about 4 months before my disappearance. I had taken a personal day from school to help my mother with some spring cleaning, even though it was clearly autumn. She had asked for help organizing the basement storage room, claiming she wanted to donate old clothes and books to charity. While sorting through boxes of childhood memorabilia, I came across a manila folder tucked beneath some old photo albums. The folder contained documents I'd never seen before, papers with official letterheads and serious-looking stamps. My curiosity got the better of me, and I began reading what appeared to be immigration records and correspondence with various government agencies. What I found made no sense in the context of everything my parents had told us about their early years in America. According to these documents, my father hadn't worked multiple low-paying jobs while building his accounting practice. Instead, there were records of substantial financial transactions, business partnerships, and investments that suggested our family had access to significant resources from almost the moment they arrived in the country. Even more confusing were documents that seemed to indicate my parents had left Taiwan not because of political instability, as they'd always claimed, but because of some kind of legal investigation. The papers were complicated, filled with legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but they painted a picture of a family fleeing not persecution but potential prosecution. There were references to missing funds, questionable business practices, and connections to people whose names appeared alongside words like investigation and warrant. When my mother found me reading these documents, her reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen from her. The calm, gentle woman who had raised me transformed into someone I didn't recognize. She snatched the folder from my hands with a force that shocked me, her face flushed with what seemed like panic rather than anger. For several minutes, she stood there, clutching the papers to her chest, her breathing rapid and shallow, as if she were having some kind of anxiety attack. I tried to ask her about what I'd read, to understand why there were discrepancies between these official documents and the family history we'd grown up hearing. Instead of explanations, I got deflection and emotional manipulation. She began crying, telling me how hurt she was that I would snoop through private family papers, how disappointed my father would be to learn that I didn't trust them enough to respect their privacy. She made me promise never to mention what I'd seen, claiming that dredging up painful memories from their early years in America would only cause unnecessary suffering for everyone involved. I agreed to keep quiet, but the questions wouldn't leave me alone. Over the following weeks, I found myself looking at my parents differently, noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The expensive artwork in their house that had always been explained as careful investments made over many years. The fact that they owned their home outright despite my father's claimed modest income during his early career. The way certain family friends seemed to defer to my parents in a manner that suggested respect, mixed with something that looked almost like fear. My relationship with Michael became strained during this period, though he didn't understand why. I wanted desperately to talk to someone about what I'd discovered, but I'd promised my mother I wouldn't mention the documents. When I tried to have casual conversations with him about our family history, asking if he remembered certain details about our grandparents or our parents' early years in America, he looked at me as if I were losing my mind. To him, these were settled matters, ancient history that had no relevance to our current lives. The turning point came in early February, just weeks before my disappearance. I was having dinner with my parents, a routine Sunday meal that typically brought me comfort and connection. My father was telling a story about his first job in America, the same story he'd told dozens of times over the years, about working as a night janitor while studying English during the day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As he spoke, I noticed details that contradicted what I'd read in those immigration documents. The timeline didn't match, the locations were different, and the financial circumstances he described couldn't possibly have led to the business investments documented in those official papers. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of small deceptions, or maybe it was the realization that everything I'd believed about my identity and family history might be built on lies. Without thinking clearly about the consequences, I interrupted my father's story and asked him directly about the discrepancies I'd noticed. I mentioned the documents I'd found, breaking my promise to my mother, and demanded to know why our family's real history seemed so different from the version they'd always told us. The silence that followed my questions was deafening. My parents exchanged a look that conveyed years of shared secrets, a communication so loaded with meaning that I felt like an outsider in my own family. When my father finally spoke, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. He told me that some questions were better left unasked, that trust was the foundation of family relationships, and that my suspicions were not only unfounded but hurtful and disrespectful. My mother began crying again, using the same emotional manipulation tactics she'd employed when I'd first found the documents. She spoke about how much they'd sacrificed for Michael and me, how everything they'd done had been motivated by love and a desire to give us better lives than they'd had. She made me feel guilty for questioning their integrity, for suggesting that they might have hidden important truths about our family's past. But this time, their deflection and emotional appeals weren't enough to silence my growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong. I pressed harder, asking specific questions about the legal documents, about the discrepancies in their immigration story, about where their initial financial resources had really come from. I wanted answers, needed them, felt like my entire sense of self depended on understanding who my family really was. My father's response was swift and decisive. He told me that if I couldn't trust them, if I couldn't accept that some aspects of their past were private matters that didn't concern me, then perhaps I wasn't mature enough to be part of adult family conversations. He suggested that I was having some kind of emotional breakdown, that my questions indicated I might need professional help to work through whatever psychological issues were causing me to create problems where none existed. The conversation ended with my parents asking me to leave their house and not return until I was prepared to apologize for my accusations and recommit to trusting their judgment about family matters. As I drove home that night, I felt like I was seeing my family clearly for the first time in my life. The love I'd always felt from them suddenly seemed conditional on my compliance, on my willingness to accept their version of reality without question. Over the next several days, I threw myself into research, using my access to online databases through the school library to investigate whatever I could find about my family's background. What I discovered was fragmentary but deeply disturbing. There were newspaper articles from Taiwan in the early 80s, mentioning my grandfather in connection with a financial scandal involving missing pension funds from the factory where he'd worked as a supervisor. The amounts mentioned were substantial, enough to fund a comfortable new life in another country for an entire family. More troubling were references to my father's involvement in what appeared to be money laundering activities during his early years in America. The businesses he'd claimed to work for as an honest accountant were mentioned in FBI investigations related to organized crime activities in the Asian immigrant community. While I couldn't find evidence that he'd been charged with any crimes, The pattern suggested that our family's comfortable lifestyle might have been built on money obtained through illegal activities. The most shocking discovery came when I found records indicating that my parents had maintained contact with criminal associates from their Taiwan days, people who had also fled to America around the same time. Some of these individuals had been arrested over the years for various white-collar crimes, but my parents had somehow managed to avoid legal consequences. Whether this was due to luck, careful planning, or cooperation with law enforcement, I couldn't determine from the public records available to me. As I pieced together this alternative family history, I realized that Michael and I had been living in a carefully constructed bubble, protected from the truth about our parents' past, but also potentially implicated in their ongoing deception. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every moment of what I'd thought was genuine love and connection had been shadowed by secrets that could destroy everything we'd built together. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable. I couldn't continue pretending that everything was normal. Couldn't sit through another family meal listening to my parents' fabricated stories about their noble immigrant struggle. But I also couldn't figure out how to confront them with what I'd learned, without potentially destroying not just our family relationships but possibly exposing them to legal consequences for crimes committed decades ago. I stopped answering my parents' phone calls, canceled our regular Sunday dinners, and began avoiding the parts of town where I might run into them. At work, I threw myself into my teaching with an intensity that my colleagues noticed, staying late every day to avoid going home to an empty apartment where I would inevitably obsess over my family's secrets. I lost weight, stopped sleeping well, and began experiencing anxiety attacks that left me shaking and nauseated. My parents responded to my avoidance by escalating their efforts to maintain contact. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, called my school to ask if I was having problems, and enlisted Michael to intervene on their behalf. When Michael confronted me about my sudden distance from the family, I wanted desperately to tell him everything I'd discovered, but I was terrified of dragging him into a situation that might ruin his legal career before it even began. The final straw came in mid-February, when I arrived home from work to find my father waiting inside my apartment. He had used the spare key I'd given them for emergencies, an invasion of privacy that felt like a violation of the small sanctuary I'd created for myself. He sat in my living room as if he owned the place, his expression calm but his presence somehow menacing in a way I'd never experienced before. Our conversation that evening revealed a side of my father I'd never suspected existed. When I asked him how he'd learned about my research into our family history, he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and told me that I'd been naive to think I could investigate their past without them finding out. He'd been monitoring my online activities, he said, and was disappointed but not surprised by my inability to leave well enough alone. He then laid out what he called the reality of our situation. Everything I'd discovered about their past was true, he admitted, but it was also irrelevant to our current lives. They had taken money that didn't belong to them, yes, but only to escape a corrupt system that would have destroyed their family. They had used questionable methods to establish themselves in America, but only to create opportunities for their children that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Every choice they'd made, legal or illegal, had been motivated by love and a desire to give Michael and me better futures. More chillingly, he explained that their past associations weren't entirely in the past. They maintained relationships with people who could be dangerous if crossed, and they conducted certain financial activities that required discretion and family loyalty. My questions and research hadn't just threatened their privacy, they'd potentially endangered all of us by drawing attention to matters that needed to remain hidden. He gave me a choice, though it didn't feel like much of a choice at all. I could accept their explanations, stop asking questions, and return to being the loving, trusting daughter I'd always been. In exchange, they would continue supporting me financially and emotionally, helping me build the life I wanted while protecting me from the uglier realities of their business dealings. Alternatively, I could continue pursuing the truth, but doing so would mean cutting all ties with the family and accepting that I would be on my own in a world that could be very dangerous for someone who knew too much about other people's secrets. As he spoke, I realized that the gentle, loving father who had raised me was either a carefully constructed mask or had been replaced entirely by someone I didn't recognize. The man sitting in my living room spoke about love and family in the same breath as threats and criminal associations. He made it clear that my safety depended on my compliance, and that the comfortable life I'd always known existed only as long as I remained willingly ignorant of its true foundations. That night, after he left, I sat in my apartment trying to process what my life had become. Everything I'd believed about my identity, my family, and my place in the world had been revealed as an elaborate fiction. I was the daughter of criminals, raised on stolen money, and now being asked to become complicit in ongoing illegal activities through my silence and compliance. The parents I'd loved and respected had manipulated me my entire life, and the brother I'd adored was living the same lie I'd been living, probably without any idea of the truth. I couldn't go back to pretending everything was normal, but I also couldn't figure out how to move forward safely. If I tried to distance myself from my family permanently, they'd made it clear that there could be consequences I wasn't prepared to face. If I tried to expose their activities to law enforcement, I'd be betraying the people who had raised me and potentially destroying Michael's future in the process. If I continued living with the knowledge but staying silent, I'd be slowly poisoned by the weight of secrets I couldn't share with anyone. The idea of disappearing came to me gradually, not as a dramatic plan, but as the only logical solution to an impossible situation. If I couldn't safely stay and couldn't safely leave, perhaps I could create a third option by vanishing entirely. My parents would assume I'd run away because I couldn't handle the truth about our family, but they wouldn't necessarily see me as a threat if they believed I was simply hiding somewhere trying to build a new life. Michael would be hurt but protected from the knowledge that might destroy his career. And I would have the time and space I needed to figure out how to navigate a world where everything I thought I knew had turned out to be lies. The morning I disappeared, February 18th, I woke before dawn and methodically packed a small bag with essential items. I withdrew the maximum amount allowed from my ATM, left my phone and credit cards on my kitchen table, and walked out of my apartment for what I knew might be the last time. I'd spent weeks planning my disappearance, researching homeless shelters and day labor opportunities, figuring out how to survive without any of the support systems I'd relied on my entire life. What I hadn't planned for was how devastating it would be to watch my family grieve for me while I hid in plain sight, living in shelters and working cash jobs just miles from the community where I'd grown up. I'd assumed they would search for me initially, but eventually accept that I'd chosen to start over somewhere else. Instead, they organized search parties, hired private investigators, and kept my disappearance in the local news for weeks. Watching them suffer was agony, but staying hidden felt like the only way to protect everyone involved. My parents' grief seemed genuine, which confused me given how they'd threatened me just days before my disappearance. Michael was devastated, blaming himself for not recognizing that I was in crisis, not understanding that my distance from the family had been motivated by love rather than rejection. The entire community rallied around my family, offering support and assistance that made me realize how much my disappearance had affected people beyond my immediate relatives. For 3 months, I lived as a ghost in my own city, watching from a distance as my family and friends struggled with not knowing what had happened to me. I worked temporary jobs that paid cash, slept in shelters, or sometimes in my car when I could afford to rent one for a day, and slowly came to terms with the reality that I could never go back to my old life but wasn't sure how to build a new one. The decision to attend my own funeral wasn't planned either. I'd been living in a shelter downtown when I saw the announcement in the newspaper that my family had decided to hold a memorial service, accepting that I was probably dead and needed to begin the grieving process. Part of me wanted to stay away, to let them have their closure and continue building whatever new life I could manage. But a larger part of me needed to see how they would remember me, needed to understand what my life had meant to the people I'd loved. So here I stand, dripping wet from the rain, watching 200 people mourn someone who is standing 20 feet away from them. I can see my mother in the front pew, clutching a tissue and leaning against my father for support. Michael sits beside them in a black suit I've never seen before, his face drawn and aged in a way that makes him look decades older than his 25 years. My students from Riverside Elementary are here with their parents, holding flowers and pictures they've drawn of their favorite memories from my classroom. The pastor is speaking about my dedication to education, my love for children, my commitment to serving others. He's describing someone I recognize, but also someone who feels like a stranger, a simplified version of a much more complicated person. As I listen to the eulogies and watch the tears of people who genuinely cared about me, I realize that disappearing solved nothing. I'm still trapped between impossible choices, still living with secrets that could destroy the people I love, still trying to figure out how to be honest in a world built on lies. The rain continues to fall as I stand at the back of the church, invisible among the crowd of mourners, trying to decide whether to remain dead to the people who love me, or to resurrect myself and face whatever consequences that choice might bring. The moment Pastor Williams asks if anyone would like to share memories of me, my hand involuntarily reaches for the heavy wooden door behind me. Every instinct screams to run, to maintain the careful invisibility I've cultivated for 3 months, but my feet remain planted on the worn carpet. I watch as Mrs. Henderson from next door slowly rises, her arthritic hands gripping the pew in front of her for support. Her voice trembles as she speaks about the young woman who used to shovel her driveway every winter without being asked, who brought homemade soup when she had pneumonia last year, who always stopped to chat about her garden even when clearly rushing somewhere important. She describes someone I barely recognize as myself, someone whose small kindnesses apparently meant more to others than I ever realized. The Rebecca she remembers sounds like a person worth mourning, worth missing, worth the tears that stream down her weathered cheeks. One by one, people stand to share their memories. My former teaching colleague Jennifer talks about how I stayed late every Friday to help her grade papers when she was going through her divorce. Mr. Yamamoto from the corner market mentions how I always asked about his grandchildren and brought them small gifts from my classroom treasure box. Even Tommy Morrison, one of my most challenging students, has written a letter that his mother reads aloud about how I never gave up on him even when everyone else had. Each story feels like a small knife twisting in my chest. These people are mourning someone real, someone who mattered in their daily lives, someone whose absence has left tangible holes in their routines and relationships. I had convinced myself that disappearing was a victimless crime, that only my immediate family would be truly affected by my absence. Listening to these testimonials, I realize how naive and selfish that assumption was. My brother Michael finally stands, his usually confident posture crumpled by grief. When he begins to speak, his voice cracks immediately, and he has to pause to collect himself. The silence stretches uncomfortably, as 200 people wait for him to find his words. When he finally does speak, what he says makes my knees weak. He talks about our last conversation, about how distant I'd become in the weeks before my disappearance. He blames himself for not recognizing that I was in crisis, for being too focused on his bar exam preparation to notice that his sister was drowning. He speaks about growing up together, about how I used to help him with his homework even though I was only 3 years older. He mentions the time I took the blame for breaking our mother's favorite vase, even though he was the one who'd been playing baseball in the house. But it's what he says next that nearly brings me to my knees. Michael describes finding a letter in my apartment after I disappeared, a letter I'd written but never sent, addressed to him. In it, apparently, I'd tried to explain that I was struggling with family issues I couldn't discuss, that I needed space to figure things out, that I loved him but couldn't be the sister he deserved while I was dealing with personal problems I wasn't ready to share. I don't remember writing such a letter, but as he quotes passages from it, fragments of memory surface. There had been a night in early February when I'd tried to write down my feelings, to organize my thoughts about what I'd discovered about our parents. I'd started several drafts of letters to Michael, trying to find a way to warn him without destroying his relationship with our parents or his future career. I must have left one of those drafts somewhere he could find it. The problem is that the letter Michael is quoting isn't the whole truth. It's sanitized, edited down to the parts of my emotional state that could be shared publicly without exposing our family's secrets. He's telling a story about a beloved sister who struggled with depression and anxiety, who felt overwhelmed by life pressures, and made an impulsive decision to run away. It's a narrative that makes sense to everyone listening, that explains my disappearance without raising uncomfortable questions about what might have driven me to such extremes. What Michael doesn't know, what he can't know, is that the real letter I wanted to write would have warned him about our parents' criminal past, about the money laundering and illegal business associations that funded our comfortable childhood. The letter I actually wanted to send would have told him to be careful about accepting financial help from our parents for his new law practice, to distance himself from their business connections, to protect himself from the consequences of their choices. Instead, he's reading from a draft that makes me sound like someone who couldn't handle the normal stresses of adult life, someone who abandoned her family because she was too weak to ask for help. It's a kinder interpretation than the truth, but it's also a lie that protects our parents at the expense of my reputation and memory. As Michael continues reading from the letter, describing my apparent struggles with feeling inadequate compared to his achievements, I notice something that makes my blood run cold. My father's expression isn't one of grief or confusion. He's listening to Michael's words with the focused attention of someone evaluating a performance, nodding slightly at certain phrases as if approving of the narrative being constructed. My mother's reaction is more complex. She's crying genuine tears. But there's something calculated about the way she times her sobs to coincide with the most emotional moments of Michael's speech. She's grieving, yes, but she's also performing grief in a way that reinforces the story they want people to believe about my disappearance. I realize with growing horror that they've orchestrated this entire narrative. The letter Michael found wasn't something I accidentally left behind. It was something they placed for him to discover. They've crafted a version of my disappearance that explains away any suspicious circumstances while painting me as mentally unstable and emotionally fragile. If I ever surface again, alive or dead, this public narrative will already be established. Any claims I might make about our family's criminal activities will be dismissed as the delusions of someone who was clearly disturbed enough to fake her own death. The congregation responds to Michael's speech with murmurs of sympathy and understanding. People nod knowingly, recognizing the signs of depression and anxiety they missed in someone they thought they knew well. Several of my former students' parents exchange glances that clearly communicate their regret at not recognizing that their children's teacher was struggling with mental health issues. My carefully constructed disappearance, which I'd intended as a way to protect everyone while buying myself time to figure out next steps, has been weaponized against me. My parents have turned my absence into evidence of my instability, my silence into proof of my inability to handle adult responsibilities. They've made me complicit in my own character assassination. When Michael finishes speaking and returns to his seat, my father rises and approaches the podium. He moves with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to public speaking, his posture straight despite his apparent grief. When he begins to talk about me, his voice carries the perfect blend of sorrow and strength that makes him seem like a devoted father bearing up under unimaginable loss. He talks about my childhood, about how proud he and my mother were of my academic achievements and my decision to become a teacher. He mentions the family traditions we shared, the Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations that brought us together as a loving, close-knit family. He describes someone who was perhaps too sensitive for the harsh realities of the world, too idealistic to accept that life sometimes involves difficult compromises. Every word is carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative of a troubled young woman who couldn't cope with life's normal challenges. He speaks about my tendency toward perfectionism, my difficulty accepting help from others, my stubborn independence that sometimes prevented me from reaching out when I needed support. All of these characterizations contain enough truth to be believable while completely obscuring the real reasons for my disappearance. But it's what he doesn't say that reveals the true purpose of his eulogy. He doesn't mention our last conversation, when he essentially threatened me into silence about our family's criminal activities. He doesn't acknowledge that I'd been asking difficult questions about our family history in the weeks before I disappeared. He doesn't hint at any family conflicts or disagreements that might have contributed to my emotional state. Instead, he paints a picture of a loving family blindsided by a daughter's inexplicable decision to abandon everyone who cared about her. He positions himself and my mother as victims of my selfishness, people who gave everything to their children only to have one of them reject their love and support in the most devastating way possible. As he speaks, I watch the faces of people in the congregation. They're buying every word of this performance, nodding along with his descriptions of my character flaws and emotional instability. Some of them probably feel guilty for not recognizing the signs of my deteriorating mental health. Others are likely reflecting on their own family relationships, grateful that their children haven't put them through such heartbreak. My father concludes his eulogy by expressing forgiveness for my decision to leave, understanding that I was probably suffering from depression or anxiety that clouded my judgment. He asks everyone to remember me with compassion rather than judgment, to focus on the good I did during my life rather than the pain I caused through my disappearance. It's a masterful manipulation that makes him appear magnanimous, while subtly reinforcing that my actions were those of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. The service continues with hymns and prayers, but I'm no longer processing the religious elements. Instead, I'm trying to understand the full scope of what my parents have accomplished with this memorial service. They've created a public record of my mental instability, established a timeline of my declining emotional state, and positioned themselves as loving parents who did everything they could to help a troubled daughter. If I ever try to surface and expose their criminal activities, this memorial service will be cited as evidence that I was delusional, paranoid, and prone to making wild accusations against people who only wanted to help me. Any law enforcement investigation into my claims would have to contend with the testimony of 200 people who witnessed my family's grief and heard detailed accounts of my psychological struggles. More immediately, this narrative serves to deflect any suspicion about their possible involvement in my disappearance. If anyone ever questions whether my vanishing might have been involuntary, they can point to this service as proof that I was clearly planning to leave, that I was emotionally unstable enough to abandon everyone who loved me without explanation. I'm trapped in a web of lies that I helped create through my own actions. By disappearing voluntarily, I gave them the opportunity to craft whatever story best served their interests. By staying hidden for 3 months, I allowed that story to become established fact in the minds of everyone who knew me. By attending this memorial service, I'm witnessing the final nail being hammered into the coffin of my credibility and reputation. The pastor asks everyone to bow their heads for a final prayer, and I use the moment of closed eyes to move closer to the front of the church. I need to see my parents' faces more clearly, to understand whether they actually believe the story they're telling, or whether they're consciously manipulating everyone present. From my new position near the sidewall, I have a clear view of the front pews where my family sits. My mother's grief appears genuine, but there's something performative about the timing of her tears and the way she accepts comfort from other mourners. She seems to be following a script, responding to cues that aren't immediately obvious to casual observers. My father's demeanor is more revealing. While his head is bowed in prayer, his eyes are open and scanning the congregation. He's not praying, he's monitoring the room, watching people's reactions, ensuring that his carefully crafted narrative is being received as intended. When he notices someone who seems skeptical or confused, he makes eye contact and nods slightly, a subtle reinforcement of his authority and sincerity. Michael's grief is the only emotion in the front row that seems completely authentic. His shoulders shake with barely suppressed sobs, and he keeps reaching up to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. He's genuinely devastated by my loss, which makes his unwitting participation in our parents' deception all the more heartbreaking. He has no idea that he's being used as a prop in their elaborate performance. As the prayer ends and people begin to file out of the church, I realize that I have a choice to make. I can remain hidden, allowing my parents to complete their manipulation of my story while I try to build a new life somewhere far from Portland. This option would protect Michael from learning about our parents' criminal past, but it would also leave him vulnerable to their continued influence and potential legal consequences from their ongoing activities. Alternatively, I can reveal myself now, in front of 200 witnesses, and force a confrontation that will expose everyone's lies and secrets simultaneously. This choice would vindicate me personally, but potentially destroy Michael's career and subject our entire family to legal scrutiny that could have devastating consequences for everyone involved. Or I can find a middle path, something that allows me to protect the people I love while still fighting back against my parents' manipulation. This option would require careful planning and strategic thinking, but it might be the only way to achieve justice without causing collateral damage to innocent people. As the crowd moves toward the exit, I notice that several people are lingering near my parents, offering additional condolences and sharing memories that didn't make it into the formal service. These informal conversations are revealing in ways the scripted eulogies weren't. People are sharing details about my behavior in the weeks before my disappearance that paint a different picture than the one my parents have been promoting. Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store mentions that I seemed distracted and anxious during my last few shopping trips, but she attributed it to work stress rather than mental illness. Dr. Martinez, who occasionally substituted at my school, says I appeared to be dealing with family problems based on some comments I made about needing space from relatives who didn't understand me. These observations don't contradict my parents' narrative directly, but they provide a more nuanced picture of my emotional state that could be interpreted multiple ways. If these conversations were happening in a different context, they might support my version of events, rather than the story my parents have constructed. I watch as my father smoothly deflects questions that come too close to uncomfortable territory, while encouraging people to share memories that reinforce his preferred narrative. When someone mentions that I seem to be avoiding family gatherings in the weeks before my disappearance, he sadly acknowledges that I had been pulling away from everyone who loved me, another sign of the depression that ultimately led to my tragic decision. He's masterful at redirecting conversations that threaten to expose inconvenient facts while appearing completely open and transparent about our family's relationship with me. Every response seems spontaneous and heartfelt, while actually being carefully calculated to maintain the story he wants people to believe. My mother handles the more emotional interactions, accepting sympathy and support, while sharing just enough personal details to seem genuine without revealing anything that might raise questions. She talks about my childhood fears and insecurities, my tendency to internalize stress rather than asking for help, my perfectionist tendencies that made normal setbacks feel like catastrophic failures. Again, everything she says contains enough truth to be believable while supporting the narrative that my disappearance was the result of mental health struggles rather than family conflicts. She's painting a picture of someone who was always fragile, always on the edge of breaking down. Someone whose eventual disappearance was perhaps inevitable given her psychological makeup. Michael, meanwhile, is having genuine conversations with people who cared about me. His grief is real, his confusion is authentic, and his guilt over not recognizing my distress is heartbreaking to witness. He's not performing or manipulating. He's simply a young man trying to understand how his sister could have been suffering so much without him noticing. Several people approach him with stories about my kindness or mentions of times when I helped them through difficult periods. These interactions seem to provide him with some comfort. Evidence that I had a positive impact on people's lives, even if I was struggling internally. He's creating his own understanding of who I was and why I might have left. An understanding based on genuine love and concern, rather than calculated manipulation. As I watch these three very different responses to my supposed death, I realize that my parents have created a situation where the truth would be almost impossible to establish, even if I revealed myself right now. They've had 3 months to craft their story, to coordinate their responses, to eliminate any evidence that might contradict their version of events. They've turned my own brother into an unwitting accomplice and created a public record that supports their narrative. But they've also made a critical mistake. By holding this memorial service, by making such a public show of their grief and innocence, they've created a forum where their performance can be scrutinized and questioned. Every word they've spoken here has been witnessed by dozens of people who knew me well, people who might remember details that don't quite fit with the story being told. More importantly, they've revealed their strategy for handling my potential return. If I ever resurface, they're prepared to dismiss anything I say as the delusions of someone who was mentally unstable enough to fake her own death. But this preparation also shows that they're expecting me to resurface eventually, that they don't believe I'm actually dead or permanently gone. This realization changes everything. My parents aren't just manipulating the narrative around my disappearance. They're actively planning for the possibility that I'll return and try to expose their secrets. The memorial service isn't just about grieving my loss. It's about establishing legal and social protection against my eventual accusations. They're treating my disappearance as a temporary setback rather than a permanent solution to their problems. This means they're probably still engaged in whatever illegal activities drove me away in the first place, still maintaining their criminal associations, still generating new secrets that could be exposed if I ever find the courage to come forward. As the crowd begins to thin and people start moving toward their cars, I realize that I need to gather more information before deciding how to respond to what I've witnessed. My parents have shown me their strategy, but I need to understand the full scope of their current activities and their plans for dealing with my potential return. I also need to figure out how to protect Michael from the consequences of whatever action I decide to take. He's clearly devastated by my loss, but he's also completely unaware of the larger forces at play in our family. Any revelation of the truth would shatter his understanding of our parents and potentially destroy his legal career before it even begins. The rain has stopped while I've been standing in the church, but the sky remains overcast and threatening. As people emerge from the building, they're greeted by the kind of gray, oppressive weather that perfectly matches the mood of a memorial service. Several people comment on how even the weather seems to be mourning my loss, an observation that would be touching if it weren't based on such a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. I watch as my parents accept final condolences and begin walking toward the parking lot. They move together with the synchronized grace of people who've been married for 30 years, supporting each other through what appears to be the worst crisis of their lives. To any casual observer, they're a devoted couple helping each other cope with unimaginable loss, but I can see subtle signs that suggest their coordination goes beyond normal marital support. They're monitoring each other's responses, making sure their stories remain consistent, ensuring that neither of them says anything that might contradict the narrative they've established. They're operating as a team in a way that suggests extensive practice at deception and manipulation. Michael follows several steps behind them, accepting sympathy from people who stop to offer final words of comfort. He looks exhausted and alone, despite being surrounded by caring friends and community members. His isolation isn't physical, it's the emotional distance that comes from being the only person in the family who doesn't know what's really happening. As I watch him struggle with grief and guilt over my disappearance, I feel a surge of anger toward our parents that's stronger than anything I've experienced during these 3 months of hiding. They're not just manipulating the community and protecting themselves from legal consequences. They're torturing their son with unnecessary guilt over something that was never his fault. Michael blames himself for not recognizing my distress, for being too busy with his own life to notice that I was in crisis. He's carrying responsibility for my disappearance that belongs entirely to our parents, and their decision to involve our family in criminal activities. They're allowing him to suffer, rather than taking responsibility for the choices that drove me away. This realization crystallizes my decision about what to do next. I can't remain hidden while Michael tortures himself with misplaced guilt. I can't allow our parents to continue manipulating everyone around them while positioning themselves as innocent victims. And I can't let them use this memorial service as protection against future accusations when I eventually find the courage to expose their secrets. But I also can't simply walk into that parking lot and announce that I'm alive without a plan for dealing with the consequences. My parents have prepared for this possibility, which means they have strategies for discrediting me and protecting themselves that I haven't even considered yet. If I'm going to fight back, I need to be smarter and more prepared than I was 3 months ago when I made the impulsive decision to disappear. As the last of the mourners leave the church and my family gets into their car to drive to the reception at our house, I make a decision that terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure. I'm going to attend my own funeral reception, not as the grieving daughter who has returned from the dead, but as someone who has spent 3 months learning how to be invisible, how to observe without being observed, how to gather information without revealing my presence. I'm going to watch my parents perform their grief in the more intimate setting of our family home, where they might let their guard down enough to reveal information I can use to protect Michael and expose their ongoing criminal activities. I'm going to eavesdrop on conversations between my family and their friends, looking for clues about their current business dealings and their plans for handling my potential return. Most importantly, I'm going to figure out how to save my brother from the web of lies and manipulation that our parents have woven around our entire family. Michael deserves to know the truth about why I left, but he also deserves to be protected from the legal and professional consequences that might come from that knowledge. As I walk back into the rain and begin planning my approach to our family home, I realize that the woman who disappeared 3 months ago was naive and unprepared for the battle she was about to fight. The woman who is planning to crash her own funeral reception has learned how to survive on the streets, how to be invisible when necessary, and how to gather information without revealing her intentions. My parents think they've won this round by successfully manipulating the narrative around my disappearance. What they don't realize is that they've just shown me exactly what I'm fighting against, and given me the motivation I need to fight back with everything I've learned during these months of hiding. The catering van pulls away from our family home just as I arrive on foot, having walked the familiar streets from downtown while the reception guests drove. I know every shortcut through this neighborhood, every alley and backyard path that could get me close to the house without being seen from the main road. 3 months of living invisibly has taught me skills I never thought I'd need, including how to approach my childhood home like a burglar casing a target. Our house sits on a corner lot with mature oak trees that provide excellent cover, especially now that spring growth has filled in the bare winter branches. The back fence borders an undeveloped lot that's been for sale since I was in high school, creating a perfect observation point where I can see into our kitchen and living room windows without risk of being spotted by neighbors or guests. I settle behind the largest oak tree, pulling my hood up against the light drizzle that continues to fall. From this position, I can see cars filling our driveway and lining both sides of our street. The turnout is impressive and heartwarming in a way that makes my chest ache with complicated emotions. These people genuinely cared about me, took time from their own lives to honor my memory, and now they're gathering in the home where I learned to walk and talk, and became the person they're mourning. Through the kitchen window, I watch my mother directing the setup of food and drinks with the efficiency of someone who has hosted many gatherings over the years. She moves with purpose despite her earlier emotional display at the church, arranging platters and setting out serving utensils while accepting help from several women I recognize as longtime family friends. Her grief appears to have been temporarily set aside in favor of hostess duties, though she occasionally pauses to dab at her eyes with the tissue she keeps tucked in her sleeve. My father stands in the living room greeting guests as they arrive, accepting condolences with the same measured dignity he displayed during his eulogy. He's changed from his funeral suit into more casual clothes, a thoughtful touch that makes him appear more approachable and relatable to the people who have come to offer support. Every gesture seems calculated to reinforce the image of a devoted father bearing up under devastating circumstances. Michael hasn't changed clothes and still looks shell-shocked, accepting embraces and kind words with the automatic responses of someone operating on emotional autopilot. Several of his law school friends have come to offer support, along with colleagues from the firm where he recently started working. They cluster around him protectively, trying to provide comfort while giving him space to process his grief. As guests settle into the familiar rhythm of a funeral reception, I begin to notice patterns in the conversations and interactions that weren't visible during the more formal church service. People are talking more freely now, sharing memories and observations that reveal details about my life and disappearance that I hadn't expected anyone to notice or remember. Mrs. Kim, from 3 houses down, mentions to my mother that she saw me loading boxes into my car late one evening in early February, several weeks before my official disappearance date. She'd assumed I was donating old clothes or books to charity, but now she wonders if I was actually preparing to leave town. My mother responds with surprise and concern, claiming she had no idea I was getting rid of possessions, but I catch a brief flicker of something else in her expression before she recovers her composure. This detail troubles me because I don't remember loading boxes into my car in February. I had been decluttering my apartment during that period, trying to organize my thoughts and possessions as I struggled with what I'd learned about our family, but I hadn't been preparing to disappear yet. The fact that Mrs. Kim remembers this incident while I don't suggests that either my memory of those final weeks is less reliable than I thought, or someone else was using my car to move items I wasn't aware of. Another conversation catches my attention when I hear my name mentioned by 2 women I don't immediately recognize. They're discussing my work at the elementary school, specifically commenting on how I'd seemed distracted and emotional during the final weeks before I disappeared. One of them mentions that I'd asked unusual questions about employee background checks and school security protocols, topics that apparently seemed out of character for my typical interests and responsibilities. This conversation is disturbing because I have no memory of asking such questions. I'd been preoccupied with my family situation during those final weeks, but I hadn't been thinking about school security or background checks in any context that would have prompted workplace discussions. Either these women are misremembering interactions with someone else, or my emotional state during that period was more compromised than I realized, leading me to behave in ways I can't recall. As I listen to more conversations, a pattern begins to emerge that makes me increasingly uncomfortable. Multiple people remember specific incidents from my final weeks that I either don't recall or remember differently than they're describing. The cumulative effect is to paint a picture of someone whose mental state was more deteriorated than I believed at the time. Someone who was exhibiting signs of paranoia, confusion, and erratic behavior that pointed toward an eventual breakdown. The most unsettling conversation involves my former principal, Dr. Rodriguez, who is talking with my father about concerns she'd had regarding my performance during my final month of teaching. She mentions that I'd called in sick several times with vague explanations, that I'd seemed confused about lesson plans I'd supposedly created myself, and that other teachers had expressed worry about my ability to manage my classroom effectively. Dr. Rodriguez is describing a professional decline that I absolutely don't remember experiencing. While I had been distracted by my family situation, I'd continued teaching with my usual dedication and competence. My students hadn't suffered because of my personal problems, and I hadn't exhibited any signs of mental instability in my professional environment. Yet here is my principal providing detailed examples of concerning behaviors that supposedly occurred during my final weeks of employment. My father listens to these concerns with apparent surprise and gratitude, thanking Dr. Rodriguez for sharing information that helps him understand the extent of my psychological decline before my disappearance. He mentions that the family had noticed changes in my behavior but hadn't realized the problems were affecting my work performance as well. His response seems genuine, but there's something about his body language that suggests he's not as surprised by this information as he appears to be. As I process these contradictory memories and testimonials, a chilling possibility begins to take shape. What if my parents didn't just discover my research into their criminal past and then threaten me into silence? What if they took more active steps to ensure my compliance, steps that affected my memory and mental state during those final weeks? The immigration documents I'd found in our basement had mentioned connections to people involved in various illegal activities. Some of those activities could have included access to drugs that cause memory loss, confusion, and paranoia. If my parents had been dosing me with something designed to make me appear mentally unstable, it would explain both the gaps in my memory and the testimony from people who observed my alleged decline. This theory seems paranoid and extreme, but it would explain several things that have been troubling me. It would account for why I don't remember many of the incidents people are describing. It would explain why my decision to disappear felt so impulsive and poorly planned, unlike my usual careful approach to major decisions. And it would provide a reason why my parents seem so confident that any future accusations I might make would be dismissed as the delusions of someone who was clearly mentally unstable. If they had been drugging me, it would also explain why they were so certain I would eventually disappear voluntarily. They wouldn't have needed to kill me or forcibly remove me from their lives. They could simply wait for the psychological pressure and chemical manipulation to drive me to remove myself. My disappearance would appear to be the tragic result of mental illness rather than the consequence of their criminal activities. The more I think about this possibility, the more it fits with what I observed during my final conversation with my father in my apartment. He had seemed remarkably calm and confident about the outcome of our confrontation, as if he knew exactly how I would respond to his ultimatum. He'd spoken about my choices as if he was describing inevitable outcomes rather than options I would need to consider carefully. Most tellingly, he had mentioned that they'd been monitoring my online activities and weren't surprised by my research into their past. If they'd been tracking my internet usage, they would also have had opportunities to access my apartment, my food, my coffee, any number of substances I consumed regularly that could have been altered without my knowledge. As I watch my father continue to accept condolences and share memories of our family life, I realize that I'm looking at someone who may have systematically poisoned his own daughter to protect himself from exposure. The warm, loving parent who raised me may have been calculating the precise dosage needed to make me appear mentally unstable, without causing obvious physical symptoms that would prompt medical intervention. This realization fills me with a rage so intense that I have to grip the tree bark behind me to keep from storming into the house and confronting him immediately. If my theory is correct, then my parents didn't just lie to me about their past and threaten me when I asked questions. They actively sabotaged my mental state and manipulated my memory to protect their secrets. But I force myself to remain hidden and continue observing, because anger without evidence will only confirm their narrative about my mental instability. If I'm going to expose what they've done, I need proof that will be convincing to people who have already accepted their version of events. I need to be strategic rather than emotional, methodical rather than impulsive. The reception continues around me as I struggle to process these new suspicions about my parents' methods of control. Guests share more memories and observations, each story adding another piece to the puzzle of my alleged mental decline during those final weeks. The cumulative picture is of someone who was clearly struggling with psychological problems that her family either didn't recognize or chose not to address until it was too late. My mother moves through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting sympathy while sharing carefully selected details about my childhood and young adulthood. She talks about my sensitivity as a child, my tendency to internalize stress rather than expressing it openly, my perfectionist tendencies that made normal setbacks feel catastrophic. Every anecdote reinforces the narrative of someone who was always fragile, always vulnerable to the kind of breakdown that would lead to voluntary disappearance. But as I listen more carefully to her stories, I notice subtle distortions of events I actually remember. She describes incidents from my childhood that are accurate in their basic facts but altered in their emotional content to suggest psychological instability that wasn't actually present. A normal childhood fear of thunderstorms becomes evidence of anxiety disorder. A typical teenage argument about curfew becomes proof of my inability to handle authority and structure. She's not lying exactly, but she's reinterpreting our shared history through a lens that supports her current narrative about my mental health. These reinterpretations are subtle enough that people who didn't know me intimately would accept them as honest parental reflections, but they're dishonest enough to fundamentally change the meaning of my life story. My father employs similar tactics when sharing his own memories, describing moments of normal father-daughter conflict as evidence of my underlying emotional problems. He talks about my questions regarding our family history as signs of obsessive thinking and paranoid ideation, rather than legitimate curiosity about my heritage. He presents my desire for independence and privacy as symptoms of antisocial behavior rather than normal developmental milestones. Together, my parents are constructing a comprehensive psychological profile that explains away any future claims I might make about their criminal activities. They're not just protecting themselves from my specific accusations. They're creating a framework that would discredit anything I might say about anyone, or anything connected to our family. Michael remains largely silent during these conversations, still processing his grief and guilt over my disappearance. When people ask him about my behavior during our final weeks together, he admits that he was too focused on his bar exam preparation to pay close attention to my emotional state. His honesty about his own distraction serves to reinforce the narrative that I was struggling alone, too proud or ashamed to ask for help from family members who were dealing with their own responsibilities. Several of his law school friends try to offer comfort by sharing stories about classmates who had suffered stress-related breakdowns during their final semester. They normalize my disappearance by comparing it to other instances of high-achieving individuals who couldn't cope with pressure and made impulsive decisions that hurt the people who loved them. Their well-meaning support inadvertently strengthens the case my parents are building about my psychological instability. As the afternoon progresses, I notice that certain guests seem to have more information about my final weeks than others. A small group of family friends cluster around my parents, speaking in lower voices about topics that appear more serious than the general sharing of memories and condolences. These conversations are harder to overhear from my position behind the tree, but the body language suggests they're discussing practical matters related to my disappearance rather than emotional reflections on my life. I recognize several of these individuals as people who have been family friends for many years, couples who often joined us for holiday celebrations and summer barbecues. But now that I'm observing them with greater awareness of my parents' criminal associations, I wonder if these relationships are based on shared social interests or shared illegal activities. One man in particular draws my attention because of the way my father defers to him, despite maintaining his role as grieving patriarch. This individual, whom I remember as Mr. Park from my childhood, seems to be offering guidance rather than just sympathy. He speaks quietly to my father while scanning the room in a way that suggests security awareness rather than social politeness. When Mr. Park notices Michael talking with his law school friends, he approaches the group and smoothly inserts himself into their conversation. Within minutes, he's gathered information about Michael's career plans, his financial situation, and his relationship with his supervising attorneys at the law firm. His questions seem naturally curious rather than invasive, but he's systematically collecting intelligence about my brother's professional circumstances. This interaction confirms my suspicions that my parents' associates are evaluating Michael as a potential asset or liability in their ongoing operations. They're not just managing the narrative around my disappearance, they're positioning themselves to influence or control my brother's future career in ways that would serve their interests. The realization that Michael is being evaluated as a possible recruit or target fills me with a protective fury that makes it even harder to remain hidden. He has no idea that his grief is being exploited, that his vulnerability is being assessed by people who see him as a useful tool rather than a person deserving sympathy. He's mourning a sister he believes is dead, while being manipulated by the same people who may have driven that sister away. As I watch Mr. Park skillfully extract information from Michael and his friends, I understand that my disappearance has created an opportunity for my parents' criminal associates to expand their influence into legitimate legal circles. Michael's grief and isolation make him vulnerable to offers of mentorship and support that could gradually draw him into activities he wouldn't normally consider. The scope of the threat to my brother becomes clearer as I observe more interactions between my parents' friends and the legitimate mourners who have come to offer support. These criminals aren't just attending my funeral reception to maintain their cover identities. They're networking, gathering information, and identifying potential opportunities for expansion or recruitment. My death, even though it's fictional, has become a vehicle for advancing their business interests. They're using the sympathy and community support generated by my disappearance to strengthen their positions within our social circle and professional networks. Every person who offers comfort to my family potentially becomes a contact they can exploit in future operations. This realization crystallizes my understanding of what's at stake if I remain hidden. It's not just about clearing my name or exposing my parents' past crimes. It's about protecting Michael and our entire community from ongoing criminal infiltration that's being facilitated by my supposed death. The longer I stay dead, the more deeply embedded these criminals become in the legitimate institutions and relationships that define our social environment. But revealing myself now, without preparation or evidence, would accomplish nothing except confirming my parents' narrative about my mental instability. The people attending this reception have already accepted their version of events, already incorporated their explanations into their understanding of my character and behavior. Simply appearing alive wouldn't automatically discredit their story. It might actually reinforce it by making me appear even more unstable and manipulative. I need a strategy that exposes the truth, while protecting Michael and the other innocent people who have been drawn into this situation. I need evidence that will be compelling enough to overcome the narrative my parents have established, documentation that will prove their criminal activities and their manipulation of my mental state during my final weeks at home. Most importantly, I need to find a way to extract Michael from their influence before he becomes so deeply involved that he can't extract himself without legal consequences. His grief and vulnerability make him an easy target for manipulation, but they also create an opportunity for me to approach him without immediately triggering the defensive responses my parents have prepared. As the reception begins to wind down and guests start making their departure preparations, I realize that this gathering has provided me with crucial intelligence about my family's current situation and future plans. I understand now that my disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a strategic opportunity that my parents and their associates have been exploiting to advance their criminal enterprises. The memorial service this morning established the public narrative they wanted people to believe. This afternoon's reception has allowed them to assess and begin manipulating the people who cared about me, turning my death into a tool for expanding their influence and control. They've transformed my attempt to escape their criminal activities into a vehicle for advancing those same activities. But they've also revealed information about their methods, their associates, and their plans that I can use against them. I know now which family friends are actually criminal partners, which social relationships are really business arrangements, and how they're planning to use Michael's career to serve their interests. Most importantly, I've confirmed that they expect me to return eventually. The memorial service wasn't just about grieving my loss. It was about preparing for my resurrection. They've established a framework for discrediting anything I might say when I surface again, but they've also revealed their fear that I will surface again with information that could threaten their operations. As I watch the last guests leaving our family home, hugging my parents and promising to check on them in the coming weeks, I understand that the battle for my family's future is just beginning. My parents have won the first round by successfully manipulating the narrative around my disappearance, but they've also shown me what I'm fighting against and given me the information I need to fight back effectively. The woman who disappeared 3 months ago was naive about her family's true nature and unprepared for the psychological warfare they were willing to wage against their own daughter. The woman who is planning her return from the dead has learned how to survive in a hostile world, how to gather intelligence without revealing her presence, and how to think strategically about complex problems that don't have simple solutions. My parents think they've buried me along with their secrets, but they've actually given me the motivation and knowledge I need to expose everything they've worked so hard to hide. The funeral they held for me today will be remembered as the moment their carefully constructed world began to unravel, not because I'm actually dead, but because they revealed exactly how far they're willing to go to protect their lies. As darkness falls and the house becomes quiet except for the soft murmur of my family's voices discussing the day's events, I begin planning my next move. I can't simply walk through that front door and announce my survival, but I can't remain hidden while Michael is being systematically manipulated and our community is being infiltrated by criminals using my death as cover. Tomorrow, I'll begin the careful process of gathering evidence and building alliances that will allow me to expose the truth without destroying the innocent people caught in the crossfire. Tonight, I'll use the skills I've learned during these months of invisibility to get closer to my family home and learn what they say when they think no one is listening. The memorial service showed me their public face, and the reception revealed their social strategy. Now I need to understand their private conversations and future plans, the discussions they have when the performance ends, and they can speak honestly about their criminal activities and their expectations for my eventual return. Standing in the darkness behind my childhood home, rain dripping from the leaves above me onto my hood and shoulders, I realize that the girl who once felt safe and loved in that house is truly dead. But the woman who has taken her place is stronger, smarter, and far more dangerous than my parents could have imagined when they decided to manipulate and threaten their own daughter into disappearing. The kitchen light stays on late into the evening, as my parents and Mr. Park discuss business at our old wooden table. From my position crouched beneath the window, I can hear every word of their conversation about expanding operations through Michael's law firm connections. They're planning to use his grief to manipulate him into providing legal services for their money laundering activities. When my father mentions that Michael is vulnerable and easily influenced right now, something inside me snaps. I spent 3 months hiding while they destroyed my reputation and tortured my brother with guilt he doesn't deserve. Watching them plot to exploit his pain finally gives me the courage I need to act. I walk around to the front door and use the spare key hidden under the garden gnome, the same hiding spot we've used since I was 10 years old. The house is exactly as I remember it, filled with the familiar scents of my mother's cooking and my father's cologne. Family photos line the hallway, including several recent ones of me that they've apparently been displaying despite planning my character assassination. My parents' voices grow louder as I approach the kitchen. They're so engrossed in their criminal planning that they don't hear my footsteps on the creaky floorboard that always announced my late-night raids on the refrigerator during high school. When I step into the kitchen doorway, the conversation stops abruptly. My mother drops her coffee cup, sending ceramic shards and hot liquid across the floor. My father's face goes white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly for me to track. Mr. Park reaches inside his jacket, but my father raises a hand to stop him. "Hello, Mom." "Dad." My voice sounds steadier than I feel. Discussing my brother's future without him again? My mother starts crying immediately, but these tears are different from her performance earlier today. These are the messy, ugly tears of genuine shock and fear. She keeps repeating my name like a prayer or a curse, reaching toward me as if I might disappear again, if she doesn't grab hold fast enough. My father recovers his composure more quickly. "Rebecca, we've been worried sick about you." His voice carries the same false warmth he used during his eulogy, but his eyes are calculating, already working on damage control. Worried enough to hold my funeral, apparently. I step fully into the kitchen, ignoring the broken ceramic under my shoes. "That was quite a performance this morning. You almost had me convinced I was actually dead." Mr. Park stands to leave, but I block his path to the door. "Please stay. You were so interested in Michael's career plans this afternoon. I'd love to hear more about how you're planning to help him succeed." The silence stretches uncomfortably as the three of them realize their carefully constructed world is about to collapse. My father tries to regain control of the situation by moving toward me, but I step back, maintaining distance between us. "Where have you been, sweetheart? We've been searching everywhere. The police, private investigators. We've tried everything to find you." His voice trembles with what might be genuine emotion or excellent acting. "I've been watching you, learning about who you really are, understanding how you manipulated me during those final weeks before I left." I look directly at my mother. The memory gaps make sense now. "What did you put in my coffee? Something to make me paranoid and confused? Something to support your story about my mental breakdown?" My mother's face crumples, confirming my suspicions without words. She sinks into her chair as if her legs can no longer support her weight. "We didn't want to hurt you. We just needed you to stop asking questions that could destroy everything we've built." "Everything you've stolen, you mean?" I turn to my father. "I know about Taiwan. I know about the pension funds grandfather embezzled. I know about your money laundering operations and your criminal associates. And I know you're planning to drag Michael into it through his law practice." My father's mask finally slips completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You always were too smart for your own good. We hoped the drugs would make you compliant enough to manage, but you insisted on being difficult." The casual admission hits me like a physical blow. Hearing him confirm that they drugged their own daughter to protect their criminal empire removes any remaining doubt about who my parents really are. "Michael doesn't know any of this," I continue. "He's upstairs right now, probably crying over the sister he thinks he lost because he didn't pay enough attention to her deteriorating mental health. He has no idea that his grief is being weaponized against him." "Michael will be fine," Mr. Park interjects. "He'll have opportunities in our organization that he never would have achieved on his own. His association with us will be profitable for everyone involved. Not if I expose everything first." I pull out the phone I've been using during my months in hiding, already loaded with photos of documents I've been collecting. "I've spent 3 months documenting your activities. Bank records, business partnerships, communications with your criminal associates. I have enough evidence to destroy your entire operation." My father laughs, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Evidence gathered by someone who was declared mentally unstable and later found dead? Evidence collected by someone who clearly faked her own death to manipulate her family? No one will believe anything you say now. Maybe not. But they'll believe Michael when he testifies about what you just admitted to drugging me." I gesture toward the staircase. He's been standing there for the past 5 minutes, listening to every word of this conversation. All 3 of them turn toward the doorway where Michael stands in his pajamas, his face a mixture of devastation and rage. He looks like someone whose entire understanding of reality has been shattered in the span of a single conversation. "Is it true?" His voice breaks on the words. "Did you really drug Rebecca? Have you been lying about everything my entire life?" My father tries to approach him, but Michael backs away. "Son, we can explain everything. Our choices have always been motivated by love for our family." "Don't call me son." Michael's voice gains strength as his shock transforms into anger. "Don't talk to me about love after what I just heard. You poisoned my sister and then convinced me it was my fault when she disappeared." The next hour passes in a blur of confrontations, confessions, and revelations. Mr. Park tries to leave twice, but finds police cars blocking the street. I had called them before entering the house, giving them enough time to surround the property while recording the conversations on my phone. My parents alternate between trying to justify their actions and attempting to minimize the damage. They claim everything they did was necessary to protect the family, that their criminal activities were victimless crimes that hurt no one, that they never intended for Michael or me to be harmed by their choices. But their explanations ring hollow against the reality of what they've done. They manipulated their own children, destroyed their daughter's mental health, exploited their son's grief, and turned a memorial service into a networking opportunity for criminals. When the police finally enter our house with warrants for my parents' arrest, I feel a mixture of relief and profound sadness. These people raised me, loved me in their own twisted way, and built a life that seemed perfect from the outside. But they also drugged me when I asked inconvenient questions and planned to exploit my brother's vulnerability to expand their criminal empire. 6 months later, I'm testifying in court while my parents sit at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits. Their criminal organization has been dismantled, their assets frozen, their associates scattered or arrested. Michael has started therapy to process the trauma of learning that his entire childhood was built on lies and criminal activity. The community that mourned my death now struggles to understand how they were so thoroughly deceived by people they trusted and respected. Some neighbors refuse to believe the evidence, insisting that the David and Linda Chen they knew couldn't possibly have been capable of such elaborate deception. I've moved to a different city where no one knows about my family's criminal history or my staged death. I'm teaching again, working with children who remind me that honesty and kindness still exist in a world that often seems built on lies and manipulation. Michael visits me every few weeks, slowly rebuilding the relationship that our parents' deception nearly destroyed. We're learning to trust each other again, to create new family traditions that aren't shadowed by secrets and criminal activity. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found those documents in our basement, if I had remained willfully ignorant of my parents' true nature. Would Michael and I have continued living comfortable lives until we were too deeply implicated to escape? Would we have eventually become willing participants in their criminal activities? But most of the time, I'm grateful for the painful awakening that forced me to confront the truth about my family. Walking into my own funeral was the most terrifying thing I've ever done, but it also freed me from a life built on other people's lies and gave me the chance to build something authentic with the only family member who truly matters. The woman who disappeared 3 months ago died in that church, replaced by someone who understands that the truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how much it hurts to discover or how difficult it becomes to live with. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.